All right, hope you're excited because it's time to round out the day with our keynote. You know what? COVID changed a lot about all our lives and infected everything we done, made us learn new things. And here to teach you what he learned in his time across COVID, we've got Howard. Howard, how you doing?
All right. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Should we get started?
Yep, get to
All
it.
right. So, if you didn't sign up for this session, then, now's the time to leave the aircraft. Um, what did we learn about DevOps with COVID-19? We learned all that stuff. So, we're done. We can just talk. Now, actually, when we think about COVID-19, think about the time before it, right? Because in most organizations and in most places, and before COVID started, it really wasn't all unicorns and rainbows, right? However, teams did get to co-locate, they get to talk to one another, they could get quick answers to any kind of questions that they had. The devil's in the details, right? But it was the COVID-19 lockdowns that changed everything. And I want to relate a story to you, right? Because in March 2020, lockdowns were first coming into force in Europe, and seismologist Thomas Lecoq of the Royal Observatory of Belgium noticed that the Earth was suddenly still. As we humans operate our factories, drive our cars, or simply walk on our sidewalks, we rattle the planet. Incredibly, these rattles can be detected as if they were infinitesimal earthquakes, and they all stopped. Now, after Lecoq's initial observations, seismologists around the world began to share data on this. And with the anthropogenic shaking of our planet subdued, they could even detect the rushing of rivers far away. The unexpected calm allowed them to use naturally occurring background vibrations, such as the crashing of distant ocean waves, to better understand the deformation of the Earth's stony crust. The coronavirus had changed the way that the Earth moved. Bold statement. But one thing that didn't really change was that we depended on our tools to fix everything. And it's my claim that using Teams didn't really result in Teams. Now, on October 4th, 2021, it was a day of infamy for Facebook. At 15:39 UTC, Facebook made a number of border gateway protocol updates, including the withdrawal of routes to their authoritative name servers. Oops. And by another 11 minutes had passed, all public resolvers had drained themselves from the caches that included Facebook's URLs. So the world died a little bit right then. There's no more Facebook, no more Instagram, no more WhatsApp. DNS, was getting all sorts of hits, and they couldn't resolve it, so that slowed everything down. Gmail, TikTok, Snapchat, everybody, they all suffered. But far worse was the fact that Facebook employees couldn't use their email, Google services, or their own in-house workplace, which was a Microsoft Teams lookalike. And Facebook was actually trying to sell this to the world. The workplace had 7 million paid customers, some big ones like Walmart, Deliveroo. So it wasn't for another 7 hours almost that the UTC, I'm sorry, 7 hours that the issue was resolved. So for almost 7 hours, the Earth stood still again, in a sense. It wasn't much longer, about a month longer. Facebook announced that Workplace was being integrated with Microsoft Teams. I don't know, maybe that's good. But it wasn't just that Facebook employees didn't know how to fix their problems. They just couldn't do it with Workplace down. Employees couldn't talk, they couldn't email each other. Even using their phones wasn't possible unless one already had the other guy's phone number, right? Workplace also handled the physical security to all of the workplace areas. badge readers were down. They couldn't contact workplace services. The New York Times, newspaper of authority, initially reported that an industrial angle grinder was needed to gain access at the servers in Santa Clara. That was later denied, but still, the whole episode reminded me of the dead hand nuclear deterrent system. It's an automated system that guarantees mutual destruction. And yeah, not so great. Now, we also kind of zoomed ourselves to death, right? When COVID lockdowns first occurred, people went nuts. They had costumes, they had nice blurred backgrounds, they had really interesting animated backgrounds. And, even, the vendors, came up and gave everybody avatar creations. Eventually, people gave up on the costumes and gimmicks. Because that was there to hold attention to people, but it was actually kind of distracting too, right? And teleconferences became less fun, right? Now, most Zoom calls that I get on nowadays have people with their cameras turned off and their audio muted, which is still funny, right? Because you can say, I think you're talking, but I don't hear you. Could you unmute? The brutal reality is that 60 to 70% of all communications is nonverbal. Body language speaks volumes, but now it's becoming a thing of the past. So here's what some of that looked like, right? Nice pants. I'm not going to stand up for you. This is me in a Zoom session that I'm running. It's an unfocused office it's animated, full of furniture that I don't own, people who I don't know walking around. And why am I doing this? Right? Well, I'm a little embarrassed about the clutter in my real background. I know everybody's got one, but I wasted a lot of valuable time putting together this believable worldview. Just don't judge me, please. And in what world does this add to the conversation? Welcome to the metaverse. On second thought, think of all the cycles and how many electrons were burned just to make this cool looking avatar of how we'd like the world to see us. Oh, by the way, can we get that with a new voice and new things to say? And then, of course, there's this, which you probably heard of, but I'll give you the highlights here. Right? Courts don't usually let cats argue cases, but here was Ron Poton, a county attorney in Presidio County, Texas, who was unable to figure out how to turn off the cat filter on his Zoom call during a hearing on the February 9th, 2021, Texas 394th Judicial District Court. And Judge Ferguson said, Mr. Ponton, I believe you have a filter turned on for the video settings. Mr. Ponton replied, as his cat face looked forlornly at the corner of the screen. Its eyes seemed to be full of terror, shame, and sadness. Can you hear me, Judge? And then he said, I don't know how to remove it. I've got my assistant here, and she's trying too. And then Mr. Ponton says, well, to get things in this hearing going, I'm prepared to go forward with it as I'm here. I'm here live. I'm not a cat. Later, Mr. Ponton said he was using his secretary's computer and that she has a young daughter, which may have been the reason for the filter, but the cause isn't entirely clear, even to this day. And the judge then tweeted something where he said, in all caps, important Zoom tip. If a child used your computer before you join a virtual hearing, check the Zoom video options to make sure that filters are off. I actually feel bad for Rod. His secretary probably still prints out his emails. And I really hope that he can still put away the powdered wig that he wears by himself. Sad, but true. We became ServiceNow's bitch, right? ServiceNow grows around 25% every year since the pandemic has started. Although I haven't checked it recently, it might have gotten closer to Earth. They have a 98% renewal rate. It's continuing to grow faster. Fourth quarter from last year, growth was 52%. I mean, gosh, why should I hate such success? Well, for one thing, ServiceNow has become the de facto way that an organization puts itself together, cements itself together, especially
Howard,
in DevOps. Yes, sir.
sorry to interrupt quickly. Was there meant to be some slides? I just noticed that there aren't any shown. I just wanted to double check if there was meant to be.
Oh,
Apologies for that.
no slides. Let's see. How could I try that again?
It should
Share.
be the share options, and you should be able to share your screen.
Oh, there it is. Has that been going on a long time?
Admittedly, yes. Apologies for that. It's weird. I was seeing something on this end, and then when I looked on the viewers end, they couldn't see it. So apologies for that. Yeah, you're great.
All right.
You're great now. It's showing.
Okay. Let me know again if it happens. Sorry about that. Um, yeah, ServiceNow has a special place in DevOps in so many organizations because it's the hub of how things change. And it's usually treated, all those changes like a one-time fix. Right. And I have a special hate because the same management that forces collaboration by use of ServiceNow measures its success in a very gameable ServiceNow metrics, right? And unhappily, this won't be the last time that I mention this service. So also, companies kind of forgot that quality matters. And this was one of those intangible things, and I wonder if you've seen the same insight, right? A company that loses sight of why quality matters is doomed, much as the Titanic was on April 15th, 1912. It never sees the iceberg in the water soon enough to steer clear and save itself. Companies need to be effective much more than they need to be efficient, right? It's efficient, if you're stuck on a highway during rush hour and everything is completely standing still, you have 100% efficiency. But you kind of realize that's not very effective, right? Efficient software development, including DevOps, can be only very efficient if it has silos doing work driven by ServiceNow tickets. Well, here it comes again. And it's run by teams that are run by project managers that use teams and force everybody to use teams, with schedules estimated by the wrong people or people who don't have enough experience to effectively give even swag estimates. Now, working this way, we don't see the terrible errors of our ways until we have train wrecks from our delivery trains and have angered customers to a competitor's product offerings. We're as blind as the Titanic was to the perils of our ways. And another funny thing happened. For those of you who don't know who that character is, his name is John Lennon. He was from a group in the 60s called the Beatles. Interesting guy. Anyhow, teams needed to keep their numbers up and meet their deliverables on the once estimated, the things that they once estimated becomes the schedule. And no one remembered the wisdom from Helmut von Moltke, the elder, that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. We might be seeing more of Helmut later too. People needed their remote jobs more than ever, even if it meant that childcare and education became like two more full-time jobs that they had to work. The Mayo Clinic reported that surveys show a major increase in the number of US adults who reported symptoms of stress, anxiety, depression, and insomnia during the pandemic, compared to surveys from before the pandemic. So that's kind of what went wrong. Why? Why did it go wrong? So this slide is entitled, "Is it safe yet?" Still from Marathon Man. with Dustin Hoffman, if I recall correctly. I became engaged with senior management, a client of mine, which, I was there for already a couple of years, and now we had a lockdown starting in March of 2020 around here. And I was saying things like, we're having a hard time establishing a productive DevOps full stack change to the already broken release train methodology that we currently used. Now would be a perfect time for some bold action. Our goal should be to make releases a normal event in development, not a once a quarter kind of thing with hardening sprints and death marches and frayed nerves, right? And speaking to the guy who headed the effort, he said, yeah, that sounds great, but you didn't do very much about it, right? So I'm here today to analyze the situation, not to necessarily judge it. Because as Kierkegaard had stated, life can only be understood backwards, but it's got to be lived forwards. Seth Godin, the marketing guru, said, the lizard brain is the reason you're afraid, the reason you don't do all the art you can, the reason you don't stop when you chip when you can. The lizard brain is the source of the resistance. Between those two maxims, probably had enough cover for management, in particular senior management that I was working with, to make safe decisions. Oh, safe, that's a coincidence, in that time of crisis. But that alone won't keep your organization from going extinct. Now, by the way, this guy in the picture, I kind of sort of know him, the Don Draper character from Mad Men. When I started working, that's kind of what things looked like. And the reference to IBM, they're a computer company. They were kind of the biggest in the 50s, 60s, and some of the 70s. Last time I heard, they're still listed on the New York Stock Exchange. So anyhow, back to my client. Kind of doubled down. Fear put a death grip on him, right? Rather than take prudent actions, such as simple things like replacing manual AWS console-based operations with Terraform and automated provisioning scripts, Brian stated that ServiceNow would now be used as the only method of managing any AWS resource across all environments. I told the client that's a pretty bold action, but it's exactly the wrong thing to do, especially under the circumstances that we were facing. And I was coaching rather, a couple of teams on Terraform, automated provisioning, automated testing, automated pipeline deployment, all that kind of stuff. And they didn't feel so great about this, right? So funny thing happened, right? There was this thing called the Great Resignation. It's a thing. I'm sure many of you guys have faced it too, right? People got fed up, absolutely fed up with being underappreciated and underpaid. They reevaluated life and what it meant to be alive. Priorities changed. The best and the brightest, they left, or they took on new and better jobs, or they decided that you only live once. Right? So while there are other industries that didn't feel the effects of are there other industries rather that didn't feel the effects of the Great Resignation? And the only industries that I can think of that weren't affected by this were farming, funeral services, and maybe mining. I'm sure there must be more, but I really can't think of any right now. Right? And that resignation, that Great Resignation, led to consequences, because those that remained tended to not to be the most experienced or the most innovative. Right? Management, they kept on doubling down on metrics tracking, using the same metrics as before. But now they're even a closer eye to efficiency. And that was because they had less employees, basically. Right? And we now had another problem, right? Finding candidates used even more cycles than it did before, because people wouldn't hire into a situation giving the offers, and that cost more process time. So, by losing the best and the brightest, kind of obvious that that would be a problem, right? So I'm not sure that the pandemic brought on these kind of reasons like career progression, flexibility in working hours, bad work environment, right? But the pandemic had a way of putting those life issues into perspective, right? Um, it's a lot easier to interview for a new job from home rather than a office setting where it can be a bit uncomfortable with people saying, "Are you are you interviewing right now?" Right? Um, things got worse than ever. Right? We're busy making sure that we measured our team's efficiencies, such as tickets processed per day. We failed to measure effectiveness because that's a lot harder to quantify. And be honest with you, after 2 years, I felt that we missed a great opportunity. We managed to grab defeat from the jaws of victory. But as Kierkegaard said, life can only be understood backwards, but must be lived forwards. So, how could we do better? Well, the first thing that we have to do is stop believing that expensive tools fix anything at all. Instead of using all the fancy collaboration tools that promise to make your teams efficient, start using Git as your collaboration tool. At first, you're going to want to rely in a DevOps sense on GitOps, right? Where environment changes are made by Git pull requests. Because that ensures that another set of eyes pairs with you to reduce the risk that you inadvertently did something stupid. Now, as teams gain trust that they won't scorch the earth with changes, consider changing from GitOps to simple Git commits to kind of get rid of the friction that still's remaining. You got to learn to treat deployments as simply another development step, albeit one with tiny changes. Right? We have to put trust into the equation. Now, I almost made this slide display an old-fashioned snake oil salesman, but in my humble opinion, those guys deserve more respect in my book than the vendors of expensive collaboration and service ticketing systems that are advertised as fixing everything. I mean, even National Public Radio, which here in the States is an alternative to the commercial stations that you normally would listen to. You have things like investigative reporters and decent background, right? Even National Public Radio plays the chill with their paid ads for enterprise AI and my favorite ticketing system that rhymes with ServiceNow. So, what else? Well, let's start thinking about sharing a keyboard, not just a screen. Instead of trying to demonstrate issues that unmotivated teams can barely see and understand in Zoom, try using something like JetBrains Code with Me, because that way you can have a true pairing session with active cursors on both ends of a call inside the IDE. You can point out to your partner where you want them to look, and they can make the changes with your verbal feedback and actually help you. And it sure beats trying to show people something on a lower resolution screencast and having them kind of verbalize any changes that you might want to do, right? Um, and on the other hand, I made that mention of JetBrains. I don't want to play this shill for any vendor, but simple, loosely coupled tools that are inexpensive are definitely worth trying, right? With that being said, how about replacing your collaboration sessions on such things as WebEx or Zoom with something that's worth the time and money, right? So, metrics are actually important. Peter Drucker once opined that you can't improve what you don't measure. But we tend to focus on the wrong stuff, the easy stuff, the stuff that the vendors provide. And then we think, hey, we're measuring now. That means we'll improve. Well, we need to do better, and we can because we have to change the metrics that we're measuring. Start thinking about capturing cycle times between incident and published fix to guide you about how effective you are, rather than obsessing on things like ticket response rates to see how efficient you are. Remember the highway. And don't forget that just reporting metrics without having any conversations about why those observations are what they are, is as useless as transcribing meaningless numbers, right? So measure the right stuff, then have conversations. Okay, let's stop with project plans, especially ones that SAFE has, right? Start by engaging teams with actual customers to see what actual problems there are that you have to solve. The end game should be a simple flow of one fix or one micro feature at a time, developed on trunk with deployment flags as needed, so you can deploy early and often. And regardless of what countless and even well-meaning consultants and salespeople have told you, it's always wiser to solve your problems than merely talk about them and complain and plan. Right. So told you to talk about Field Marshal Helmut von Moltke. That's him on the first picture on the slide. He noted that no plan of operations extends with certainty beyond the first encounter with the enemy's main strength. Right, so here he is. Right, told you we'd be seeing him. Anyway, von Moltke advocated being able to respond to a variety of enemy moves and not wasting too much time with too much detail on any one plan, which may or may not occur. Right, now, that nowadays we'd call that kind of an agile way of thinking about things. Right, back in 2004, and this is spoken to the guy on the bottom of that slide, US Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld stated, "You go to war with the enemy that you have, not the army that you might want or wish you had at some later time." And I'm not here to tell you that your customers are the enemy or that you should treat software developers as war. But I will tell you that having a team surround one issue at a time, completing it and making sure that nothing is harmed in the process, is the best practice possible from both a lean waste perspective as well as a customer satisfaction perspective. You could be I want to say, engage with your developers, not just manage them, right? Empower them for their real jobs, the jobs you hired them to do, and not just the tasks along the way, right? Because people are not a fungible commodity, and never call them resources. Grow your personnel with love and care. Don't be afraid to spend on them, much as you might in a fruitful relationship, right? In that same vein, always strive to change and improve your relationship and never be a boss. And a couple of words about that, right? Because you could be, as a manager, a health protector. You're making sure that your employees are aware of what's available for them to improve and promote their value inside the organization for things like pay bumps and whatnot. You can be a traditional manager. You take all the credit when things go well and give all the blame when things don't. Or you can be a boss, right? Someone who, but for their title and position, you would not even waste time on. Someone who makes your otherwise day intolerable because the task to do given by someone who isn't even cognizant of what needs to be done. Someone who really gets off when people stop to attention and salute, kind of, as you pass. For God's sake, if you want to be a boss, join the army. Just don't be that person. Um, and fix your hiring practices, right? And the one that I'm going to think of first is stop using certification-driven development. So I've been at this game for a long time, right? Since the 70s. And I was an XP programmer back in the 90s. In fact, I still am, right? When the Agile movement started in the early 90s, I was all on board. And it was really kind of fun working with organizations to see how they could become agile themselves. It was a mixture of finding process and improving technical practices that made it great. But then Scrum comes along and started the agile industrial complex. By the time that SAFe came along, right, which is another, let's say, 7 years or so after that, um, most coaches had abandoned technical practices because there are a lot more agile coaches around, and many of them never had any technical skills anyway, right? And because of their influence, clients really didn't understand the need for technical coaches because SAFe makes the world into an amalgam of letters. That's their business model, right? They sell certifications. It was all downhill from then. About 5 years ago, I attended a conference, and all of a sudden I stopped in the middle of the presentation. I kind of looked out at the people. Remember being in real conferences? Looked out at people, and I went into a tirade about how I was quitting all the organizations with certificates and why this was the end game in Agile, right? I gave up all my Agile process coaching because I felt it made me complicit in the Agile industrial complex. And I became a pure technical coach, primarily doing DevOps stuff, because process coaching was so dogmatic that it felt like an industrial process without even the benefit of Taylorism, right, which is the scientific study of the one best way, right? So stop hiring based on lowest cost of specification. And I want to also point out that employment should be relational, not transactional. So act accordingly, right? Now, I probably heard a lot more about him than you guys have, but the previous president of the United States, and I will not speak his name, used to love to talk about great deals, right? He had a great way of hiring contractors for the best deal, and then stiffen when it came time to pay. It was the most transactional president the world has ever seen. In the end, it's better to have a great relationship with those that can come through for you when the going gets tough. Just ask President Zelensky about that. So that's kind of like how we could have done better. So let's talk about some takeaways here. First of all, there were a whole bunch of missed opportunities. The workplace issues that came up with COVID-19 were not proximately caused by the virus. But the DevOps workplace response, that was a terrible missed opportunity to improve. I still claim that we didn't even swing at the ball when we came to dealing with DevOps workplace and how to deal with lockdown and work from home. But just because we failed to rise to the opportunity doesn't mean that we can't try now to make our plight better. And there's a huge root cause behind all of this, because the issues that were highlighted during lockdown, they ultimately come down to trust. And in particular, many management organizations, they just don't trust their employees, especially when they can't look out their windowed office and see them all working, right? Now, I predict that businesses are now starting to pay for that. So I want you to look back, and maybe some of you have read this book. Maybe some of you, it's a new thing. It was about 20 years ago. A guy by the name of Patrick Lencioni wrote a book called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. Now, the book is actually really short. It's less than 100 pages. It's a really quick read. It's written as a parable, and it explores the fundamental causes of organizational politics and team failure. Now, I really don't have time to discuss the book, today, but I'll just go straight to the punchline, right? And in it, Lencioni gives his 5 dysfunctions of a team, and it all starts with absence of trust, where people are unwilling to be vulnerable within the group. He says that's the base dysfunction. Now, once that sets in, that leads to fear of conflict, where the team applies artificial harmony over constructive, passionate debate. That leads to a lack of commitment, where the group decisions are created with ambiguity, so that the organization, really doesn't have anything to work with because there's no buy-in. That leads to avoidance of accountability, where the group ducks its responsibility to call on peers and superiors with their counterproductive behavior, and that sets low standards. Finally, inattention to results, where people focus on personal success, status, and ego before team success, because their teams serve no useful purpose anymore, and everyone is just kind of out for themselves. Too many organizations still manage like this today. They have, the whole stack of dysfunctions to look back on. And when the marketplace becomes, is such that there are fungible, inexpensive resources to fill in for those who quit or are forced out, organizations get away with a lot of distrust of employees. I feel that the calculus is changing across all the workplaces as a result of COVID-19 induced changes. And software development in the future may not be all that much different than restaurants workers, given a lot of time. Why do organizations manage like this? Well, they kind of do it because they can get away with it. That is changing, and that's a good thing. But again, trust. Got to start trusting people. So, are we starting to live in a new normal yet? Right? COVID-19 changed the formulation of how office life is lived, and it's not going back to the way that it was, right, anytime soon. So, we're still living, even today, in uncharted waters. Change entropy isn't about to go back into that lantern willingly. So, let's take time to think about what needs changing. I think we can start with 3 items. So seize the day, seize this moment to change for the better, starting with hiring, moving on to how we partition work, and ending with how we execute work. So well, those are my 3 wishes. I'm interested in the Q&A to see what yours are. The picture. On October 1st, 1974, we were told to be happy in life, make our dreams come true, and to do that, we should stay hungry and crazy. Right? Stay hungry, stay foolish was written on the last page on the back cover of a legendary magazine to understand what the first Silicon Valley and its original spirit. And that magazine was called the Whole Earth Catalog. It was written by this guy named Stuart Brand, who was an American writer and entrepreneur. He was born in 1938. He's also known for the Whole Earth Electric Link, which was normally shortened to the WELL. It's the oldest continuously operating virtual community, and it was launched in 1985. That's not the end of Stuart, right? 1996, he was at it again, and he started a nonprofit in San Francisco that seeks to start and promote long-term cultural institution called the Long Now Foundation. It aims to provide a counterpoint to what he views as today's faster, cheaper mindset and promote slower, better thinking. Anyhow, the Long Now Foundation hopes to creatively foster responsibility in the framework of the next 10,000 years. A few years ago, the clock of the Long Now was started, which seeks to build a 10,000-year mechanical clock. I guess they couldn't find a battery that could operate for 10,000 years. Anyhow, they manufactured this, and the site construction of it, their first full-scale prototype, was funded by Jeff Bezos and Bezos Expeditions, $42 million, and it's on land that Bezos owns in Texas. Anyhow, back to the Whole Earth Catalog. In 2005, Steve Jobs gave the Stanford commencement speech, and he referred to the Whole Earth Catalog. He said, "When I was young, there was a spectacular magazine called the Whole Earth Catalog, and it's one of the Bibles of my generation. It was like Google, but made of paper, 35 years before Google was invented." So, getting back to this picture, October 1st, 1974, they had a special back cover, which is what you're seeing on the slide. And in a strictly black background, there's an image of an eclipse above. And below it, in the photo, it's one of those typical kind of American streets in the West, probably at dawn, and not even a person around, and above the words, "Stay hungry, stay foolish." We can never be successful standing still. Getting fat, dumb, and happy is not our goal. And while we're still here on Earth, never forget that joy, as well as a thirst for life, are the keys to a successful life. So I implore you all to also stay hungry and stay foolish. Anyhow, thanks to Douglas Adams, I can say so long and thanks for all the fish. And we should now have sufficient time for some questions, some answers. We can debate some topics, and then we'll depart for the day. And that concludes our presentation.
Ooh, damn, I thought you were going to keep zooming out there. I thought it was going to go. I was like, whoa, the layers coming out on this one.
Yeah, this is I'm still the last person in the world possibly that uses Prezi. I kind of like it.
I mean, it was looking nice there. I mean, there's a little bit of frame jit, but when it's smooth, it looks smooth. So, yeah, no, thank you for that. It was a really insightful talk. We haven't got any questions lined up just yet. But folks, if you've got anything like the Q&A, there's literally a tab. Just click on it, and you can type out your questions there. Anything like while we've got him, because we've only got him for limited time. Although I'm sure if you guys have something you want to send him across later on, he'll probably be nice enough to respond. We were saying like we caught him at a good time of the day as well, because we've had 2 Americans on today, and one of them had to wake up at 3 a.m. So right now he's probably shaking his fist, going, "Howard."
No, I'm open for anything at all, right?
Yeah, I think it's like so you raised some interesting points. I mean, I found it like really compelling, like, and really hooked me with like the brief kind of description for this whole talk, right? Like the comparison to 9/11, which like, oh, everyone likes to make this comparison because it really instantly makes you wake up. But it's very true that like, we aren't necessarily fully learning from what COVID brought, right? What it tried to change. And it does feel like there is a lot of resistance and a lot of pushback now, where everyone thinks things are going to go back to how they were. I mean, in your experience, like what was the biggest kind of standout like obstacle, or shall we say example, where essentially it just felt like some company or some employee had completely ignored what's happened the last 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, well, I think that has to do with management style,
Hmm.
right? You know, and that trust issue. There's just too much going on. The guy that I kind of quoted him. I didn't name him out because I don't think that's proper. Um, he's a nice guy. He really thinks good thoughts, but it rattled him to all kinds of questions like, "Oh my God, what am I going to do? What about people with H-1Bs? What about this? What about that?" I was like, his name was Fred. That's all I'm going to say. Fred, easy. It's okay. In fact, this could be a defining place to learn, organizationally about how to handle ourselves, what we want to be in the future. But that lizard brain mentality kind of steps in, and people get very reluctant because they don't want to be responsible for something. In his case, he wanted to be promoted in the organization. And he felt that the best way to do that was, to be risk adverse and do what he was told to do. And I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I'm much more risk tolerant, and I think that that's what we should be. That's what agility kind of teaches us to be, right? Is to be tolerant by putting the high priority, risky things up front, validating them, or discarding them, or pivoting, or and we tend not to do that in big organizations. We tend to like to talk about things a lot, spend months and months planning, and then give way too little thought to how we're going to do this.
Yeah.
Still,
It's the I think it's like that kind of the emerging market opportunity, right? Like where you're in these situations, like COVID was a perfect example of this. You can try to like stay with what's tried and proven, and maybe find a
mhm,
weird way to adapt it, and you see like a 1 or 2% growth. But then like that might seem good in a vacuum, but what are your competitors doing? What are other people doing, right? People who are willing to take this risk might be seeing a 20% increase, a 50% increase. When it fails, maybe they see a slight decrease, but especially when you have these kind of soft resets or these hard resets, really, for what COVID brought, the
mhm,
potential loss is far outweighed by the potential gain.
yeah. Yeah, I don't know. To be honest with you, it saddens me that collectively we didn't have a better response, and
Yeah.
that we let our baser instincts rule us, especially here in the States,
Mhm.
with things like masking requirements and stuff.
I think
I, I,
it speaks to that whole logic of like people don't necessarily respect what preventative is, whether you're talking
mm-mm,
like on common courtesy level of like real life of things like masks, or even in business, right? Like we changed our method of thinking to protect against this possibility. It's like when you
yeah,
take insurance, you say, well, I didn't need the insurance. Like, yeah, but if you crashed the car, or the house had burnt down, right? Like how much in the negative would you be right now? And I think it is very scary how easily we can overlook that. Looks like we have got some questions coming through from the crowd. Lucas, first
yeah.
up, says the term company got away with it was used quite sometimes. I agree, it is scary, but why is it so? Weak management?
Actually, it's very strong management,
Hmm.
right? Because most organizations treat the let's just keep this with developers as like the least valuable part. you know um and what happens, and this is nothing new, right? If you think back to the Mythical Man Month, which was a book written in the early 70s about how IBM developed the system, uh, 360, for their 360 line of computers, right? They recognized the fact that taking the best people in your development team and saying, hey, you know really well how to do this stuff. I got a great idea. Why don't you go off and hire a team of people to work for you, and you can manage them so that you can spread your knowledge across everything. And that's the worst thing that ever occurred, right? These people that had great skills now were put into an impotent position where they couldn't get stuff done.
Hmm.
And we had the same problem during COVID-19. We took our management, which was very strong, very effective at keeping things on plan and moving forward, rather than doing what they should be doing, right? Which would be um, enable the teams to be successful, give them the money that they need to buy things, give them the money that they need to pay their employees properly, right? One of the worst things that strong management does, it says, oh, how can we lower our development costs? Again, this is a US kind of a problem, right? How
Yeah.
can we lower our development costs? And they love the idea that we can hire people that are in my case, like 10 and a half hours away, in the Asian subcontinent. Um, and then they force them to like work on our time. It's like, man, that's not a good idea. Don't you trust them? If they're part of the organization, let's bring them in. Let's do things. So no, I don't think it's weak management. I think it's very strong management.
Hmm.
That unhappily is something that we've lived under. It intertwines with the concept of shareholder value, and the whole concept of Harvard MBA as the way to manage your organization and matrix it, which means silo it. All that is probably started in the U.S. starting in the late '80s, and I don't like it.
No,
And
it feels inflexible, right? I guess it also, the problem is there's always these kind of proof cases, right? These examples of like why it has to be this way. I'll never forget in my development days hearing the story of like someone who ended up getting fired because for 4 years they'd been offloading their work. They'd been contracting a developer in Asia to do the
mhm,
work for a quarter of what they were being paid, and then obviously just pocketing the difference. And
right.
security issues aside, obviously there's the whole length issues, but those are pristine examples that leadership will use to say, this is why we need to be very restrictive. This is why everything has to have our oversight, and you have to work to our standards and our exact way of doing things.
And this is something that has developed in the United States. And again, it's not just from the '70s, it's even before that. We used to produce products. We were very product oriented, and the quality in products. And in fact, if you look at advertisements from the '50s on tech related kind of stuff, I remember seeing something from Merck, where Merck was very dedicated to improving the lives of others through the pharmaceuticals that it produced. Not that it wasn't making money, but they focused on the pharmaceuticals rather than focusing on the costs. And nowadays, it's not like that at all. Right? Pharmaceuticals are still risky to put into the market, and the way that companies do it. My wife used to work for Bayer. Is buy the small biotech companies that are producing the proto drugs, and if they fail, psh, away you go, taking another one, to put it into our pipeline of drugs. And that's not what Merck was doing in the '50s. They wanted products, and we've lost it. Anyhow,
Yeah. It's that kind of like it's that insulation from blame, right? It's the same reason why we see so many layers to the hierarchy in larger
yeah,
companies. Is like it essentially insulates the wider company from being implicit in whatever occurs, whether it's a failure or something legal, whatever. So yeah,
yeah,
it does get in the way of progress. I can see where you're coming from. Looks like
yeah,
we have a question from Christianus. I'm gonna
yes.
like word this a bit differently because they link to an article. Like we're gonna have time to quickly read through that full thing. They said, in a sense, developers have a lot of say in regards to where slash how they want to work due to the market conditions. I think the point
Mhm.
he's trying to get to is, do you think that that is going to change, or do you think that it's going to remain the state where developers are essentially empowered when it comes to their working conditions?
Look, I would love to see. I've worked my whole life to see that problems get solved by the right people in the right ways. And I do believe heavily that we're over managing things. Um, and if I were to take off my rose colored glasses for a second, I think that the future is even worse, right? Because if we can sufficiently break down tasks into small bite sized chunks and then feed them to a remote developer and say, when you've done this, click here and come back for more. You know, um, Software as we know it isn't going to be that much different than people that used to work on a car line, an assembly line. They just do this, boom. Now do this next one, boom. And ultimately that will lead to a real problem in innovation
Hmm.
because we've tried to cut the cost so much to maximize the economic throughput that it's not good for people who do this because they enjoy solving problems. They enjoy helping others. They enjoy, all that's taken out with that equation. And you can have people from around the world, doesn't matter what time zone they're in, right? They can do this task, boom, they get another one. So that's unhappily what I see happening. And I'm scared,
Yeah.
saddened, it's
It's an interesting thing to think about because I guess like for a long time, something that kind of protected against this is this it's a reality that maybe doesn't come across to people who are just like on the more business side, where they say, "Oh, we've got a problem. Let's hire more coders. Let's hire more people." It's like that doesn't necessarily mean the work's going to be faster because there's a lot of conflicting ways to code. But I guess to your whole point, it's if there is this restriction, if there is this kind of factory print, right? This stamp down. This is how we code. This is how we code all the time. That is probably being accelerated by the modularity of code and the
Hmm.
microservices.
Hmm.
Then
Hmm.
we arrive at a stage where that is feasible, right? And to your point, you said about creativity, like the innovation that exists, that has allowed technology to come so far in such a small amount of time, just
Yeah.
disappears overnight.
Well, I can relate a story to you, which is how long ago was this? Maybe 10 years ago. Was consulting at a company in Manhattan that was in healthcare, what we call healthcare. And, they just take your money and give you back 80% of it. But anyhow, they're in healthcare, and they had all these products that they wanted to put together, or I should say projects. They weren't really anyhow. Um, and the CTO was asking me for advice. Actually, CIO. There's a big difference. And the CIO comes into my office and he says, "Let's, I want to lay out this situation for you." And he talks about, the economic goals for the company, the amount of budget that he was, looking to use to do this. And he said, "Well, I decided that the best thing to do would be to hire these 60 people in where was it? Mumbai, but
Mm.
he found a consulting company from India, and not just denigrate, Indian developers. I know many of them are really good, but it was on his terms, right? And his primary reason for doing it was that I forget what the ratio was then, but he could hire like 8 Indian developers versus one developer in the States, in particular in New York. And Bob, his name was Bob. We talked about it a little bit. I said, "Bob, can I give you an alternative way of thinking about this?" And I said, "Instead of hiring like 60 developers, in India, how about if you hired 5 developers here and let them do the work? Let them actually go ahead and figure out this stuff on their own, and it's going to be 5 good developers, right? And it's going to be 5 developers that maybe make close to what you make, right? They're not going to come cheap."
Yeah.
And he kind of like rattled his head and said, "Nah, I don't think so." And the next morning, promptly after I got in, he told me, "Oh, time to go." Didn't like that advice.
Yeah,
Um,
I guess it's that whole logic of like the less necessity of oversight for these American workers in that example. Maybe they're specialists in that role, and I guess maybe the thing that can become polarizing is when you have these deep hierarchical structures. You're not in the
yeah,
situation where he's probably sitting there. Maybe he's thinking, "It's a really interesting point that you've got there, Howard. Only one problem with that: if these people are that proficient." Is my role even required anymore? And then you
absolutely,
get into a
absolutely.
deeper discussion. You're like, whoops, you've disrupted the status quo essentially.
A lot of people have like to have a lot of people reporting to them,
Mhm.
and we tend to call them bosses. They like the idea of a lot of people, but they don't know what to do with them, which is to let them do the stuff that you hired them for. But anyhow, I digress.
Yeah, I mean, we could keep talking for hours, but I think we're about ready to close this one out. It has been an absolute pleasure to pick your brain, Howard. So thank you very much for
Well,
coming in to talk.
thank you and everybody at DevOps Pro Europe for the opportunity. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. But that means we come to a close today, folks. But don't worry, it's only day number 2. One more day to go. But before we close out, I have got to give a big thank you, of course, like to all our speakers, including the wonderful Howard to round us out here. But also a big shout out to our sponsors, Accenture, TechTree, and Rocket Software, without who we couldn't be putting this together. And of course, big shout out to you folks at home. Like, honestly, if you weren't here, this would just be an echo chamber or me and Howard just, talking over a drink. Instead, we get to share this information, and that's what it's all about. So, once again, big shout out to you. Hopefully, we'll see you again tomorrow. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you again in the morning.
Bye now.